The Daily Code Snippet. Today we will take another look at how Web Access Pro can be used in practice to analyze and fix a site for accessibility. Last week we looked at color contrast errors. This week we will review what other errors are being noticed and how we would begin to modify our code to fix the errors found. We are here again in our Web Access Pro tool to take a look at what are the other errors that we need to take a look at on this site. And we're just going to go through some of the things that are being noticed. And what we're looking at is the issue of aria roles not being clearly defined. And so that's something that we're going to need to do. And it's on owl-next and owl-previous. So owl in our website is a carousel controller. And so basically we need to define better our arrows that tell the site to go to the previous and next image. So those need to be defined better. And so we have issues with aria labels on our buttons. So again, and this has to do with the owl carousel. So a lot of the owl code actually came from the carousel itself when I decided to use it for controlling the carousel on my website. So it may be that I just need to, take a look at the canned code that was given to me when I downloaded this code and refine it better and make sure all the aria roles are clearer. And so we have to take a look too at these issues of our navigation having the multiple static elements with the same ID attribute. So I'm going to have to take a look and see. It may be that instead of using a hashtag for our element, we need to instead use a class attribute, because if we're repeating something, then it's more appropriate to use a class attribute. And so we have a similar situation with our columns and additional issues with our owl code, it looks like. Yeah, so these have to do with the thumbnails that appear when you're hovering over an element. Go to our home page. And usually when you hover, you see a thumbnail come up. And this is controlled by some JavaScript code that I have. And I use ID attributes, but it seems to have an issue with that from an accessibility standpoint. And that's something that I'm going to have to take a look at. So again, most of these have to do with the JavaScript that's pulling up different thumbnails and projects. So I'll have to take a look at how I can reword that, since it doesn't seem to like the use of the hashtags. And then we have an empty heading that needs to be fixed. And we need to identify the main landmark. And again, this has to do with aria labels needing to be more defined on any of our links. So those are the main issues with the site that we're going to have to go back and take a look at the code and see if there's something that we can do to fix these and have this better. So we would have to disable this meta tag that doesn't allow a user to zoom on mobile devices. Again, this is code that's associated with the owl carousel, that there should be an ability to be able to focus on the element, and it's not. And these are the next and previous, these next and previous buttons that toggle going to the next image, that they need to be more clearly defined for an assistive device. And we aren't naming our landmarks clear enough, and that's what most of these errors have to do with, that we need to adjust and more clearly define our landmarks. So those are the main things that we're seeing here that we need to fix, and this would make our page more accessible. And let's go to a project page just to see. Go to art in embassies because this has, I know that it has multiple projects. Not every client has multiple projects in this way. So this is an issue with the navigation that we saw on the index page, that there are duplicate ideas. So we need to fix that. We haven't named our language. We haven't identified our language on our HTML page. So we need to, that's an easy fix to add, and that we need to clarify what our main content is, that our links need to be labeled more appropriately with aria labels in order to make it more accessible, and then the issue with the meta tag. Code on these project pages is very similar from page to page, so as long as we identify what's the issue and we copy those changes to the rest of the project pages, that should be a fairly quick fix. So one of the things that would be a fast fix is to correct the language and make sure that our language is identified, which is the language of our website is in English. And the links mostly have to do with our navigation. So if we fix the navigation on our main page, it should be fixed on our other pages as well. So these are the things that we need to do to fix this website in terms of accessibility. So here we are with our code that we're going to try to start making these fixes. We see that on our index page we have declared the language, so it's only on the project pages that we need to fix that issue. And we can see that, first of all, it's really difficult to look at our code because we have minified it. And what does that mean? When you have deployed your site on a server, in order to make our websites more efficient, we tend to minify the code, which means removing any extraneous spaces and information and making the code files smaller. That way they can be loaded up and they'll be faster. And while this is great for running our site, it's not so great for editing our site because it's really difficult to look at minified code. So one of the things we want to do is unminify our code to make it easier for us to edit it. And so all you really need to do is do a search for unminify in a search engine, and you'll come up with all sorts of sites that do this. And so I've come upon unminify.com. I'm just going to paste my code like it says, and then I'm going to say, please unminify it. Done that, and then we can unminify code. So it basically downloaded it now as a text file. So now it's unminified, and we can go ahead and exit out of that. And what I'm going to do now is copy this code, delete the code in my original file, and repaste it. So often it's easier to look at code if it's not scrunched up in this way. And so we can more easily look at code when it isn't minified. And our unminifier didn't succeed in unminifying everything. So we kind of have to do some of it manually. We see that, like this is the viewport meta tag that was causing an error that a user should be able to scale on a mobile device. So we can go ahead and edit that, and then we won't have that accessibility error. Basically, with accessibility, you want to give as much control as possible to the person that is viewing your site. But we have a lot of important things here that we've declared our language in English. We have declared our character set in UTF-8, and that's important that that's there. Now, looking at this over here, we see that we have several scripts. This is a script for basically a Google tag. So this is for Google Analytics. And you can see that we have added commenting to help us identify this code. So we have the script here for Google Analytics. And we have a script here that's loading our style sheet, our CSS style sheet. And then now we have a comment here that says that this link is loading our style sheets that have to do with the OWL code. And we mentioned that the OWL code is for control of a carousel that we had added to this website. And then, of course, most websites need to load the jQuery library, which is for JavaScript, because our site has different functionality that requires JavaScript. So we are loading different JavaScript to help run our website. And we're loading also Modernizer, which is another script that's used to help make our website function better. And we also have a script that's loading the JavaScript that has to do with our owl carousel. And we have added our own JavaScript that has to do with our hyperlinks. And this is adding easing. So that means that it doesn't happen immediately. There's a little bit of a delay. And then we have our script that adds our thumbnails that hide and show. And this was the issue where it was having multiple ID issues. So we used the hashtag to identify this. It may be that we may not be able to change it to a class. We can try to see if it works, but sometimes with certain scripts, it's better to use an identifying mark, an ID mark. We'll see. If the script breaks, then we'll have to leave it, but it is something that's being flagged as an issue with accessibility. And you can see here, this is our end tag for our head right here. And we have a body, and we have a header. So our header contains our logo information, like we said, our main H1. It also contains our navigation. And so we have our navigation, and there were several issues with the navigation not having enough information for assistive devices. So we can try to break this up so we can read it more easily, to see if there's something we can add to make it clearer to devices, assistive devices, what's going on, so that it doesn't continue to flag our tool as being an accessibility issue. And then we see here we have a social navigation as well. And we have the social navigation for a non-mobile device, and we have a navigation for a mobile device. So we need to go through and make sure that our navigation has the appropriate aria labels that it needs. And we see our divs are closing over here, and then we have our header ending over here. So we'll have to take a look. It looks like we have an extra closing UL tag. So we will double check this, but it looks like this is a duplicate. So we can delete that. Yes, so we have our links here, and what we may want to do is add aria labels to our links to make it clearer that to a user where they are going. If we look further down, we do have our container. We use container instead of main. So that may be something that we can change to make it have better descriptions in terms of aria landmarks. So we could change our div ID container to actually main, which is a type of semantic markup that identifies the main content. So that might be something we could do. And we do have a section 1 and we have a section 2. And we have a section 3, which is our client list. And then we have our section 4, which is where we have our staff section and studio information like location. And our container ends over here after the last section. And then right under here, we have additional scripts that are used to control some of our toggling of the bios for our staff. This is additional scripts that basically tells the person where they are in the navigation. So it's just another cue to a person that you have the active link will be of a different styling so that they know that's the active link. And then down here is code that's being used to control our slider, in that we've created a randomizer that will randomize the slider to different sets of images depending, so that if you were to come back to the site several times, you won't see the same slides coming up. So that's what the randomizer is for. And then again, we have another analytics code down here. And it might be duplicated, so we could make sure that it is exactly the same. And then if it's just a duplicate, we can go ahead and delete that and clean the code up a little. So in order to make this easier to read, we can add back the carriage returns that are removed with minifying. And you can see that it's basically a list of items, and this corresponds to our client list. And by unminifying it and adding back these carriage returns, it makes it a little easier to look at. And so it makes it easier to identify things that might be wrong. And we can always re-minify it once we have edited the code to our satisfaction. But you do have to be careful when you're doing this type of editing, because you might introduce an extraneous character that might break a code. So just be very careful when you're editing code that you don't add or subtract things that are necessary. So this is the end of our first column list. Those are museum clients, and then our second list are for non-museums. So we have this header, an H2 header, and we have our unordered list opening over here. And it looks like we never closed our unordered list over here. So it's a good thing that didn't create an error. But let's see, when you unminify the code, it becomes easier to look at things, and you can notice small things that sometimes when you make an error in coding, it doesn't necessarily break it, so that you may not see that the error is there because the computer is able to ignore that error. But other times the errors that you make that have to do with an errant semicolon or an errant div, closing div, will break your site, and so you do have to just be careful. And so this is section 3. This is what it looks like when it's sort of clearer to look at. And then now we have section 4 over here. So this is section 4 that contains our contact information, and it also contains the profile information, and it has this toggling that occurs so that you can have this bio appear or not appear depending on whether the person has toggled it open. So we can already see that it's a little easier to look at our code now that we've kind of added those carriage returns. I think the most difficult area to sort out is the section 2, which is our work section that has all the individual products. And yeah, so this is, it was objecting to this use of a blank header over here. So we're gonna have to take a look at that, and if there's another way to. So while I enjoy using BBEdit, it's a very plain code editor. It still does enough color coding that it becomes easier to identify new code. So it's enough for me to be able to differentiate one line of code to another. But I think for someone who might be beginning, it's hard to look at sometimes all this code together. But with time, it becomes easier to understand. Next time, we will work on fixing the issue with the ID attributes, the aria labels, and aria landmarks. Presented by Designers Learn Code.